We're now going to talk about ecology. This is a coral reef. You can see the coral. There's a whole bunch of organisms that actually live here. I'll give you an example. So, besides these fish, here and here, we've got sea anemone. Let's see, I'm not sure what this is, but there's probably all sorts of different animals in here. A lot of invertebrates, perhaps like shrimp, mussels, things like that. So the thing is, what's the question is that what is ecology? And what does it mean for an organism to interact with its environment? And furthermore, what is an environment? What are the components? Well, an organism, let's say we take a wolf, lives in northern temperate forests and boreal forests in the far north. It doesn't hibernate, and it hunts all winter long. And there's a number of physical components to the environment. Physical in the sense of temperature, humidity. So the temperature, low temperatures most of the time except in the summer. Not necessarily high humidity. A lot of very cold temperatures. There's not much water in the atmosphere, but there's certainly a lot of snow on the ground. And then the biotic environment would be the interactions that wolves, let's say, have with all the other animals or all the other organisms around there, from parasites that might infect it, the animals that might eat it, the animals that might be dangerous to it, the animals that might compete with it, including its own kind. Those are biotic interactions. And also, environmental factors affect the distribution and abundance of organisms. And I'll take a look at that a little bit later, but I'll remind us then. So, I want to take a look at the classroom. The classroom is actually an environment. There's abiotic classroom environment, namely temperature. There's habitats that are not made by living things. Well, it is, we actually make these chairs and everything, but we can consider them, let's say, part of the abiotic environment. And then the biotic environment, there might be other, let's say, organisms in the classroom, but like insects, but who knows. But the main interactions are going to be actually with our fellow students. And this is a social environment. And I would say in humans, the social environment was probably the most, it's one of the strongest selective forces on human beings. It governs all their social interactions, whether it's cooperating, competing for sexual mates, female choice, male choice, all that kind of stuff. So there's probably a lot going on in the social environment. Some of you also, you probably have friends in this classroom, and you probably treat those friends differently than individuals you don't really know. Not that you treat them bad, who knows, you might, but probably not. You just wouldn't treat them, you don't know them as well and you don't trust them as much. So, furthermore, there's classroom niches, which means that we're going to say what is a niche? Well, a niche is kind of the job that an animal or an organism does and the place it does it. So we can say in the classroom we have all these different individuals in this class. And we can say that there's kind of niches. There's some people who probably always sit up in front. Why do they do that? Well, perhaps they're they can't hear as well, or they feel more engaged. They're less likely to fall asleep during my kind of boring lectures, that sort of stuff. Perhaps they are in the back. Maybe they're shy, or it could be that someone is using their computer or tablet and they need to have it plugged in, and there aren't any electrical sockets that they can reach up front. So those are kind of places, different places in the classroom. Okay? Now, in addition, there are different personalities. There are probably some personalities that are kind of the joker, always making jokes, including me. And then there's others that are more serious, that are, taking notes all the time. There are probably others who, let's say, mooch off their friends' notes. These are all kind of different aspects or niches that humans, in terms of behavior, can do. So there's all different kinds of ecology. And the first one we're going to look at is behavioral ecology. So behavioral ecology is the study of the evolutionary basis for animal behavior and the proximate causes of that behavior. We usually distinguish between different kinds of causes. In other words, proximate causes, such as a cue. Let's say a visual cue. Let's say a monster comes in the room. You get a visual cue that makes it energizes your flight or fight response. It also energizes the production of adrenaline. Those are more proximate cues. The signal from your eyes goes to the brain and activates, the adrenaline, and you immediately perhaps run. The ultimate causes have to do with fitness. In other words, how the behavior actually affects an animal's fitness. So, in this this little figure here, we've got two axes. On the x-axis, we go from the x-axis. Here we go. Look at this. So, this is a fixed kind of pattern. An animal does the same kind of behavior the same way every time. As you move to the right, the behavior can become more flexible, condition dependent. Oftentimes, so it'll be very flexible. Often, different behavior under slightly different circumstances. And then on the y-axis, we go from an innate modification. So there's no modification through learning. It's an inherited behavior. Animal doesn't have to think about it. A good example is, let's say, the sucking behavior of newborns. No one teaches them how to do that. They do it automatically right away. But then as you go down, you get to modified behavior. In other words, you can really modify certain behavior through learning. A good example of this, of course, is language acquisition. Another example might be learning how to hunt, all sorts of different things. Okay, so there's different kinds of behavior. There's fixed action patterns, which are highly stereotyped, conditional strategies, more flexible learning, neural and hormonal mechanisms involved, communication. So let's take a look at a couple of different kinds of animal behaviors in terms of behavioral ecology. So to elicit a behavior, you usually have some sort of stimulus, and then the behavior flows from that. Here we'll see a kind of interesting behavior.
ya, itu kata.
In this case, the stimulus was actually kind of a supernormal stimulus, which means that it didn't actually have to be a female cow. Anything that kind of resembles a cow will do. The bull came over and tried to mate with a motorcycle. Now, of course, mating, so the proximate cue, of course, was the motorcycle. And then there was the sexual behavior, so kind of fitness consequences, so is that ultimate behavior. Here we have another kind of behavioral ecology. So this involves bats and their maws that they prey upon. And the bats have a way of using echolocation, as you probably know, to find out where insects are in the dark. But it turns out the insects have an interesting defense against that. So let's take a look at this.
Slow motion night vision technology allows us a glimpse inside the bat's world. Sonar detects insects in complete darkness. A big brown bat targets its prey and locks on. But new science reveals that the tiger moth has a secret weapon. Ultrasonic sonar jamming technology. Its high-speed clicks are slowed down so we can hear. When the bat locks on, this moth fights back. For a moment, the bat is truly blind. The jammer moth uses a sophisticated strategy to survive, but other deserts present even greater challenges.
So some interesting behaviors here. First of all, we've got a predator-prey relationship, which is a kind of antagonistic coevolution between bats that are targeting their prey and prey that have a defensive strategy that can stop the bats from preying upon them. So So there's certainly an evolutionary component to this, but the proximate causes, the bats have echolocation. They send that out, it comes back, the rebound comes back to them, and they have a nice visualization of where the moth is, perhaps how fast it's moving, and all that. Now, it turns out moths can also hear, so when they hear the sonar that the bat is sending out, as the bat gets close, because the sonar actually gets louder, they jam it, and so thwart the bats from actually eating them. Now, it turns out there's even another strategy that moths use, and sometimes what happens is when the sonar is coming, the echolocation, it hits them, they sense it, it triggers neurons into kind of discombobulating their flying. So there's a sensory neuron, an interneuron, and then a motor neuron attached to the muscles that suddenly the muscles are uncoordinated and they kind of fall haphazardly out of the sky. But there's one other thing. There's also a thing that the bats can do to overcome, let's say, the bat jamming sonar of the moths, and that is instead of sending out this loud signal, they actually send out this a much softer echolocation signal that the moths actually have a hard time picking up. Another kind of ecology, or another branch of ecology, is how do individuals or organisms interact with the physical world in which they live. So ecology is a huge field, just like evolution and evolutionary biology. And so in this case, we looked at behavioral ecology. Here's organismal ecology. This is an organism's interaction with its environment, of course. We're looking at an antelope ground squirrel right here. Ground squirrels typically have a diet of seeds and nuts and some insects and whatever, but mainly what they do is they are food hoarding animals. So when they find a lot of nuts, they can only eat so many, or seeds, but they often put the rest into caches, like they cache, in other words, store food just below the soil surface, and they put one or two seeds there. And then later on they might come back and recover those seeds. And in this case, if they don't, of course, then this animal is actually performing a mutualistic benefit for the plant, because it turns out this is a desert environment, and if you're buried or kind of planted, you have much higher germination success and seedling establishment. But of course, these antelope ground squirrels are in it for themselves. They want to eat the nuts. Fortunately for the plant, though, they can't eat all the nuts at one time, and so they do this caching behavior. So obviously the stimulus in this case would be, this is desert peach, which is kind of like an almond. It starts out a little bit fleshy, but then all you have is a nut with the kernel inside. These animals, usually one sets up in a plant with a lot of fruits, and then pretty much takes all of them, eats a few, but buries the rest all around in these small surface caches, and it has a great spatial memory about where it put those caches. So there's a number of different behaviors involved. First of all, it's getting the nuts, and then in terms of you have to bury the nuts, and you also have to remember, and so it's got a great spatial memory. And then it'll come back perhaps and recover most of them, but maybe not all of them. Another part of ecology is population ecology, kind of what you did the symbio on in terms of population growth. So a population, it's a number of individuals, it's a group of organisms, or it can be widgets, a group of widgets. Anything can be a population. In this case, if we look at this picture, it's a population of wildebeest on the Serengeti. And populations change in size. If there's more resources, the population will grow. If there's fewer resources, the population will perhaps reach a peak and not move anymore. If it goes over, then usually the population will then crash back down. So let's kind of take a look at that. Here's population ecology. Now, normally we have kind of an exponential growth if there's no limiting resource. But we also normally have the same sort of thing, but there's a carrying capacity. In other words, the amount of resources that can actually support a population. So, this is the unlimited resource curve. You see this kind of exponential growth in bacteria, but of course when they reach a certain threshold, it kind of bottoms out. Okay? And then here is what's called a logistic curve. And at the carrying capacity, as the resources become, as a limiting resource, the population grows. It might overshoot it. It goes back and it's kind of hits that. Now, there's another thing going on though too. Sometimes populations never hit their carrying capacity. And you might ask why that is happening. Okay, so let's take a look. So here we have this carrying capacity. Well, there might be predators that are preying on the prey, the population prey. The predators might prey upon enough animals that the population gets only to a certain size. It never reaches carrying capacity right here. It always stays down here. So the predators are eating the prey and keeping it low here. And so this has a profound effect on the population. Obviously, it's a smaller population, but it's usually a healthier one, because when an animal hits the carrying capacity up here, or when the population does, there's fewer resources. A lot of individuals might starve. Whereas when they never reach that, there's more than enough food, and the individuals are usually in better condition. Another kind of ecology is community ecology. This involves a community of different organisms, different species. And in this case, we're looking at a food web. At the lowest trophic level, which is right here, right there, these are primary producers. In this case, plants. If it was let's say a marine ecosystem, a water ecosystem, then the primary producers would probably be algae. Now, there are then primary consumers, which is a second trophic level, right here. So we've got a bunny, we've got a type of quail, we've got a mouse. I'm not sure, what is that down here? Anyway, these are primary consumers, and they're the second trophic level. So they're eating the grass, the seeds, and other stuff from the plants, from the primary producers. Then there's the next trophic level at 3. And what these animals do is they prey on the primary consumers. Right? So this badger might eat this guy, or it might eat the bunny rabbit, right? And it is still relying on the primary producers, but it's actually an indirect interaction. Okay? And then, of course, we also have, finally, the 4th trophic level, right here. And these are actually carrion eaters, or we have a hawk. And a hawk might, well, it's usually going to eat, as the hawk is going to usually eat, let's say, these guys and these guys as well. But it will probably also eat carrion. Now, each organism has a niche, and we haven't really discussed the niche. What is a niche? It's actually an organism's place in the biotic environment, including the habitat it lives in and its adaptations to utilize the resources it needs to survive and reproduce. It's actually not, it's a little, I made a kind of a mistake here. It's an organism's place in the environment, including the biotic environment and the abiotic environment. In this case, we have a grassland. And we have certain temperature regimes. In this case, it's probably spring or summer. In the wintertime, this might be covered in snow. Okay, so a niche is the place that an organism is found and where it lives. So, for example, we've got this burrowing owl right here that lives in a burrow that a rodent has usually dug. And so it's living in a very specific place, habitat. Then, of course, when it comes out, it flies around looking for prey items. So its job is, of course, if it's going to be successful, is to hunt prey, then produce these eggs down here, and they'll hatch into chicks, and if they hunt enough, they'll be able to supply the chicks with enough food, and the chicks will fledge and become owls, burrowing owls. So each of these different organisms has a niche. In this case, the niche for the grass is this prairie under certain temperature regimes, and there's things that are eating the prairie, well, in other words, predators or herbivores. And each level of the trophic level is a kind of a different niche. Now, finally, we look at ecosystems. How does energy and nutrients cycle through ecosystems? So ecosystems, we look at energy and nutrients and how they cycle. So let's start with, we have the energy, which is the sunlight. Oops, sorry. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so we have the energy from the sunlight. Right here. We have primary producers in these trees and plants, and they provide the nutrients for then primary consumers right here, including here. And then finally, we also have higher level consumers, in this case a bear, a leopard, a hawk, a hyena, and a fox. And we also then have like detritus feeders, in other words, mostly fungi. Okay, so there's this whole energy cycle. Solar energy, heat energy usually escapes. Energy stored in the chemical bonds from the glucose that plants make during photosynthesis, and then these nutrients that provide food for consumers. You should notice that energy is actually not recycled. It's either captured by producers, transferred through consumers, and each transfer you actually lose energy. Okay, now, so this is ecosystem ecology. You probably know about a little bit about ecosystems. For example, right now, if we actually look at where we live, which is right along the coast here, this is actually chaparral and coastal sage. If we go up into a little farther north, we get into evergreen forests. Here, all this yellow are deserts. This is temperate forests. These are deciduous forests, subtropical like Florida and the Gulf Coast. And then if we finally get down into Mexico, we get a combination of what I would call wet forests or thorn scrubs and rainforests. And then we can probably get, let's see, down here, in the Amazon basin, these are all rainforests, including at higher elevations cloud forests, more kinds of deserts, more kinds of forests, tropical forests. Here, then we have kind of a subtropical, let's see, grassland. And then down here is very much like up here in the Pacific Northwest, evergreen rainforests, where they get a lot of rain. So there's all these different biomes. We can see tropical wet forest, which is what is it? It's the orange. Subtropical desert is yellow. Tropical dry forest is the red. Tropical coniferous forest. Let's see. Oh, that's what that is. So this is the tropical coniferous forest. This is the dry forest. And then there's other sorts of things here. Okay, so these are terrestrial ecosystems. Now, one of the things that's going on is we're losing a lot of these different ecosystems primarily because of human use and fragmentation, so we cut down forests, all that kind of stuff. So there's now kind of a subdiscipline called conservation biology, and study, preserve, and restore threatened populations, communities, and ecosystems. And you can kind of see it includes some basic science like botany, zoology, microbiology, evolution. It involves some applied science, in this case, wildlife, biology, fisheries, agriculture. And then in the middle, where this whole thing kind of intersects, population and conservation biology. Okay. Now, we also asked earlier, of course, why are organisms found where they are? And we went through all the different ecological factors that have to do with, in fact, why things are found the way they are, where they are. And this included, of course, abiotic factors, organisms' interaction with their environments. Let's say this wolf in the cold northern boreal forest or tundra. Biotic factors, their interactions with other animals or plants or other organisms around them. So we have, here we have this insect feeding on this flower, probably the nectar. But there's also historical factors. So interactions with abiotic and biotic factors mediated by history. And what I mean by history is including evolutionary history back perhaps hundreds of millions of years. So we have on the right here these are ratite birds. Ratites, so here we have an ostrich. Originally there was one big continent called Gondwana land, and then due to tectonic plates moving, different continents moved and separated. Probably the first group to separate was Australia and Antarctica. This was finally followed by a separation between Africa and South America. Okay. Oh, actually, I was a little wrong there. So this actually up here was going to be India. There's also Madagascar down here. There's India here in our kind of present configuration. Australia. And there's all these ratite birds that are related to each other because of evolutionary history. They all share the most recent common ancestor in Gondwana land. And then as these continents broke up, each group went off on their separate evolutionary trajectories. So emus let's see, where emus in South America, I forget what it is in Australia. There were also some extinct birds. So these were elephant birds. These are moas. Both are extinct. Actually, that's not a moa. Sorry. These are moas that are extinct down in New Zealand. And each of these groups, once they became separated, they went on their own evolutionary trajectory. So one of the reasons that we have organisms found where they are also involves their evolutionary history. And, of course, if an animal wasn't there to begin with, or an organism wasn't there to begin with, the only other way it could possibly get there is through dispersal. So let's take a look at this. And in terms of evolutionary history, not only were these populations of these ratites separated because of vicariant events, in other words, tectonic plate movements, but then there's also dispersal going on as well. Of course, these animals probably don't disperse very well because they don't have they're flightless birds. So it seems more likely that it was because of vicariance, but a lot of things get to where they are because of dispersal. For example, the Galapagos finches in Darwin finches in the Galapagos Islands, they were started initially by a colonization event from mainland South America. A few birds probably got blown out to sea, 600 miles, landed on one of the Galapagos Islands, started a population, then perhaps dispersed to other ones as these islands emerge because they're volcanic. Okay. So, plants and the planet. All life on Earth depends on the ability of plants to harness the energy of the sun through photosynthesis. Photosynthesis in plants is carried out in chloroplasts. These are organelles, right? You can see each of these are cells, and they have these little tiny organelles in them that carry out photosynthesis. And what photosynthesis does is it converts sunlight as energy, carbon dioxide, and water into glucose. Now, chlorophyll has these pigments that absorb red and blue light and reflect green. Let's see, here's the equation for photosynthesis. So, you get sunlight, we'll say, plus carbon dioxide, CO2, plus water, H2O. Then photosynthesis is carried out with all these things, and we end up with glucose, which has a lot of carbon molecules together, strung together, okay, and also oxygen. Now, it turns out, what happens with this glucose and oxygen? Well, the oxygen floats up and is used by organisms that use aerobic respiration, like us. And the glucose is the basis of the food chain. And then, of course, we eat glucose. We also eat other animals that eat the glucose. And as we exhale, we're exhaling carbon dioxide. So this creates kind of a big cycle. So here we are. Photosynthesis. Sunlight energy, CO2, H2O. Here's glucose. And here's oxygen. And then glucose metabolism. This is what we do. Glucose is broken down. That we're eating, and we consume the oxygen, and then we at the end of the cycle, we end up with more CO2, which goes back to here, and H2O, which goes back to here, and there's all this ATP for growing. So you can see these. This is the carbon cycle. And carbon is being cycled from photosynthesis, creating sugar and oxygen. The consumers of photosynthesis, they breathe oxygen. They use ATP energy to put on, to create, let's say, more cows. Including offspring. These cows also, of course, when they breathe out, after breathing in the oxygen, they breathe out CO2, carbon dioxide. There's also water made in this reaction. And the water is, of course, cycled and then back into photosynthesis. So this is the carbon cycle. This is part of nutrients, so ecosystems. but this goes on across the whole planet. So normally, if you look back at this cycle, let's say photosynthesis, right here, produces glucose, metabolism, right? This is eaten by these animals and that do, or other organisms that do cellular respiration, release CO2 back in the atmosphere. Here we have carbon dioxide. And it's kind of in balance, but it does change. It hasn't always been exactly equal. Now, right now, there's a build. Carbon dioxide has a funny effect. One of the reasons now there's a buildup is because we're burning fossil fuels, which create CO2. So instead of animals or other organisms during aerobic respiration releasing CO2, we're releasing tons of it in the form of fossil fuels, which are burned. And fossil fuels essentially are hydrocarbons with, basically, it's kind of like glucose, but it's been transformed into hydrocarbons over millions of years. So here we are burning fossil fuels. Lots of CO2 is released, lots of H2O is released, and then lots of energy, which we use. Unfortunately, there's another problem. Before, forests, because they're all plants, they would take in excess CO2, right? And convert it back into more glucose, right? But when forests are actually cut down, instead of all these plants taking in CO2, there's no more plants left. And so we have this buildup of carbon dioxide that we wouldn't normally have. Now, carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. So here we are with carbon dioxide. Other greenhouse gases include methane. So the cow that we looked at before, while he's eating, she's eating grass, she also produces methane. We also do too, in the form of farts. And then another thing that we produce that is produced that has a greenhouse effect are nitrous oxide. Unfortunately, greenhouse gases, such as CO2 right here, so the sun's rays come down, heat is produced down here. Now, excess heat usually escapes, but if greenhouse gases are too high, then instead of being the heat escaping, the greenhouse gases, the heat is trapped. And so the planet then warms up. We have very good evidence right now that there is global warming going on. And we also have evidence as well that where human beings are the cause of global warming. Now, I just want to point out that the Earth has gone through global warming and cooling before without any help from humans. So, for example, volcanoes release a tremendous amount of greenhouse gases, including CO2. And in the past, during the Permian mass extinction, there was volcanoes releasing, like the whole area of Siberia was one large volcanic release. It's called the Siberian traps. Produced tremendous amounts of greenhouse gases. They built up in the atmosphere. They also built up in the oceans and turned the oceans into kind of acidic, which killed off all the life in the oceans. which was the basis for a lot of the food chains. And then we had, as a result of this, we had this tremendous die-off or mass extinction. Okay, there's also other reasons for global warming, depending on the tilt of the Earth, and the Earth's rotation around the sun is not, it kind of wobbles and changes, and so during certain time periods, it's closer to the sun, other times it's farther from the sun. Okay, now, global warming now, we're in a period that normally we wouldn't be having global warming. It's a little bit warmer than it was, let's say, during the last glaciation, but not nearly as warm as, let's say, during the Permian. Okay? And global warming affects organisms because many organisms are actually adapted to specific temperature ranges. They're also water temperature and salinity of the water and how acid the water is in terms of pH. And then, of course, global warming causes, let's say, ice at the poles and in glaciers to melt, which runs into the oceans. So here's Antarctica, it's melting. It ends up adding water to the oceans and the sea level rises. Okay, so here's average concentration of CO2. It's been increasing throughout the Industrial Revolution, but it's increased rapidly in the last 50 or 60 years. So up around 2010, this is actually older, it's continued to increase as well. Furthermore, it looks like it's global, the carbon dioxide is from us, because this carbon dioxide is actually a different isotope than you would normally get from, let's say, volcanoes or from plants or animals that release CO2. This is the kind of isotope you get from fossil fuels. Okay, and then also we know that in the past, forget about humans, CO2 concentration has risen several times in the past, and each time the Earth's temperature has increased as well. So we have evidence of this, not only in cores of ice samples from glaciers, but also in terms of the pollen that's produced by plants. So certain plants will be living in certain environments. If it gets colder, they're going to they're going to use less CO2, but as it gets warmer, CO2 levels are going to rise as well because you have more plants and animals. Okay. Here's over a 400,000 year period. We can see fluctuating CO2 levels right here. I guess I should just use that. Okay. Okay. All right. And then back up here. Now, at the same time, temperature has followed the same sort of line. So each time CO2 goes up, temperature does too. Right? So we get the idea. So CO2 concentration is actually the cause, because of greenhouse gases trapping heat, that raises the overall temperature. And now I mentioned in the past that CO2 levels have changed in the past. They've been high in the past, right? So right here. These might have been because of volcanism, volcanoes, or let's say higher CO2 levels because the Earth is, let's say, the rotation is closer to the sun, more carbon dioxide is released by plants, all that kind of stuff. So this is the whole idea behind climate change and how it's driven by this carbon cycle that we looked at before. And that's it.